One Sunday morning, the preacher stood before his congregation, delivering a passionate sermon on the importance of forgiving one's enemies. "For if we cannot forgive," he declared, "how can we expect to be forgiven ourselves?" At the end of his sermon, he turned to his congregation and asked, "How many of you are willing to forgive your enemies?" About half the hands in the room went up. Unsatisfied, the preacher launched into another 20 minutes of heartfelt preaching, driving home the virtues of forgiveness. Then he asked again. This time, around 80% of the hands were raised. Still not content, he doubled down with another 15-minute plea. By now, most of the congregation was thinking more about Sunday dinner than about forgiveness. When he asked one final time, every single hand in the church shot up, except for one. At the very back, 97-year-old Mrs. Jones sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. The preacher, intrigued, pointed at her. "Mrs. Jones, are you not willing to forgive your enemies?" She smiled sweetly and said, "I don't have any." The preacher was astonished. "That is truly remarkable. Mrs. Jones, at 97 years old, you have no enemies at all. Please come forward and share with us the secret to such a peaceful life." The frail old lady slowly made her way down the aisle, took a deep breath, turned to the congregation and said, "It's simple. I just outlived the bastards." A sweet but anxious elderly woman picked up the phone and dialed her doctor's office, her voice trembling slightly. "Doctor, I have a question about this new medication you prescribed me." "Of course," the doctor said. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated for a moment before asking, "Is it true that I have to take this for the rest of my life?" The doctor sighed. "Yes, I'm afraid so." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, in a voice filled with growing concern, the elderly woman finally said, "Well then, just how serious is my condition? Because this prescription is marked no refills." On a scorching afternoon, old Scrooge the miser and his young grandson Tim were trudging home from a party. Sweat dripped from Tim's brow as he eyed a nearby bus stop. "Gramps, it's such a long walk home. It's hot. I'm tired. Can we just take the bus?" Scrooge gasped as if Tim had just suggested giving away his life savings. "A bus? Do you know how much that costs? $6. What a waste of money. We'll walk." Tim sighed but didn't argue. He knew better than to fight his grandfather over money. They hadn't gone more than a few steps when a taxi drove past. Scrooge immediately flagged it down. "How much to take us to Springfield Avenue?" he asked the driver. The driver barely glanced at them before saying, "That'll be around $20. Scrooge clutched his chest like he'd been stabbed. $20? That's outrageous. No, thank you. He waved the cab away with a huff. Tim stared at his grandfather in disbelief. "Gramps, did you really think a taxi would be cheaper than a bus ride?" Scrooge scoffed. "Of course not, boy. Don't be ridiculous." Tim frowned. "Then why'd you even ask?" Scrooge grinned smugly. "Because, my foolish boy, by skipping the bus, we already saved $6. Now, by not taking the taxi, we've saved $20. That's $26 still in my pocket." Two elderly ladies, Edna and Beatrice, went to visit their longtime friend, Mary. They settled into her cozy living room, chatting about old times and the latest gossip. After a while, Mary suddenly smacked her forehead. "Oh, how foolish of me! I haven't even offered you coffee!" She hurried to the kitchen and returned with steaming cups. The conversation continued until half an hour later, Mary gasped, "Oh dear, how foolish of me! I haven't even offered you coffee!" Without waiting for a response, she bustled off and brought another round of coffee. Another 30 minutes passed, and Mary once again looked shocked. "Oh my, I haven't even offered you coffee." Edna and Beatrice sipped their third cup in silence, exchanging knowing glances. When it was finally time to leave, they bid Mary farewell and walked down the street. Edna shook her head. "Mary is acting really strange, don't you think?" Beatrice nodded in agreement. "I know. We were there for hours, and she never even offered us coffee." Edna stopped in her tracks, staring at her friend in disbelief. "Wait a minute. You went to see Mary? And you didn't even invite me?" Two women were chatting. One of them, curious, leaned in and asked, "Hey, what's the real difference between a love marriage and an arranged marriage?" Her friend grinned mischievously. "Well," she said, "it's simple. In a love marriage, you know the size of the tool beforehand. In an arranged marriage, it's all about luck." Margaret was a prim and proper lady, raised in a time when certain topics simply weren't discussed. But as much as she tried to ignore it, she had a problem, a rather persistent and silent problem. After much internal debate, she finally decided to consult her family doctor. Sitting across from him, she took a deep breath and leaned in. "Doctor, I have a terrible gas problem." The doctor, maintaining his professional demeanor, nodded. "Tell me more." Margaret blushed but continued, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Yesterday afternoon, I had lunch with the Secretary of State and his wife. During the meal, I had, 6 silent emissions." She cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Then last night, at dinner with the governor and his wife, I had 4 more." The doctor raised an eyebrow. Margaret sighed. "And just while sitting in your waiting room, I've had 5. Doctor, please, you've got to help me. What can we do?" The doctor leaned back, folded his hands, and without missing a beat said, Well, Margaret, the first thing we're going to do is schedule you for a hearing test.